On May 2, 2026, the largest ultra-low-cost carrier in Florida simply ceased to exist. No warning, no transition. Spirit Airlines canceled every single flight before dawn, stranding thousands of passengers in terminals across the country. And in a single day, the largest airport in South Florida lost the airline that carried nearly 1 in 3 of its passengers. The question nobody could answer that Saturday morning was, who would take over this territory? The answer came hours later, from a carrier that was already positioned to strike. For 6 consecutive years, Spirit was Fort Lauderdale's largest airline. In 2024, at the peak of its operation, it carried 11 million passengers through the airport, a 31.4% market share. To put that in context, in a market where competitors fight for every percentage point, 1/3 of the entire airport was in the hands of a single company. Spirit wasn't just another budget carrier. It was the backbone of South Florida for price-sensitive passengers, Caribbean routes, and Latin American connections. The collapse wasn't simply the disappearance of another low-cost carrier. Fort Lauderdale was Spirit's most important operation, with nearly 50% more departures than the airline's second-largest city by volume. When Spirit left, it didn't just leave empty seats. It left an operational hole of a scale that no recent airline bankruptcy in the United States had created at a single airport. The shutdown removed more than 21 million seats from the American aviation system by the end of 2026. More than 81% of that impact was concentrated in just 15 airports, and Fort Lauderdale was at the top of the list. This wasn't a regional crisis. It was the largest market vacuum American aviation had created in years. Fort Lauderdale was never just an alternative to Miami. It was a strategy disguised as convenience. The airport processes a very specific passenger profile: families hunting for cheap Caribbean getaways, price-sensitive tourists, and heavy cruise traffic departing from Port Everglades, less than 2 miles from the runways. While Miami International serves executives and long-haul intercontinental flights, Fort Lauderdale dominates leisure traffic, exactly the segment that grows fastest in total trip volume. Controlling this airport means controlling the gateway to the Caribbean and Latin American routes that no traditional business carrier can make profitable on its own. Spirit generated nearly 13% of total revenue for the Broward County Aviation Department, the authority that manages the airport. When it disappeared, the airport didn't just lose passengers, it lost a structural piece of its budget. The ground wasn't just vulnerable, it was on fire. JetBlue hit the panic button the same day, and this time the panic was strategic. On May 2, 2026 itself, the carrier announced 11 new routes from Fort Lauderdale, rescue fares starting at $99, and the immediate absorption of Spirit's stranded passengers. No merger process, no regulatory approval, no waiting period. JetBlue simply walked through the open door Spirit left behind. The expansion pushed JetBlue's daily departures at Fort Lauderdale to nearly 130 flights, a 75% increase over 2025 levels. 75%. That's not organic growth. That's a carrier reinventing its entire operation in a matter of weeks. 6 of the new destinations were cities JetBlue had never served from Fort Lauderdale before: Barranquilla and Cali in Colombia, Baltimore, Charlotte, Columbus, and Indianapolis. JetBlue's president, Marty St. George, had declared just days before Spirit's collapse that Fort Lauderdale was the third leg of the stool in the airline's route map, alongside Boston and JFK in New York. The expansion wasn't improvised. It was the execution of a plan that had been waiting for exactly this moment. The early signals look promising, maybe too promising. In Q1 2026, JetBlue reported revenue per available seat mile growth of 6.5%, with consumer demand proving more resilient than expected. For a carrier that closed 2025 without operating profit, that number matters. It's the difference between an expansion strategy that holds its own and one that bleeds capital while trying to grow. But there's a distinction management still hasn't made convincingly. Growing market share is not the same as being profitable. JetBlue filled routes. That's undeniable. What remains open is whether it can charge enough on those routes to justify the operation. Total capacity at Fort Lauderdale dropped by nearly one-third. In April, Spirit and JetBlue together offered more than 637,000 seats. September 2026 schedules show roughly 425,000. Less competition, less downward pressure on fares. The environment looks perfect, but fewer seats also means less total revenue for the airport. And JetBlue is operating in a context that remains hostile. Capturing territory is always the easy part. Monetizing it is where airlines go to die. Management itself acknowledged that macroeconomic uncertainty represented more than 4 points of headwind in 2025, blocking the return to profitability despite years of restructuring. At the same time, fuel costs exploded. Spirit's collapse was directly caused by the surge in jet fuel prices driven by the ongoing conflict in Iran. The same bomb that took down Spirit is still live, and JetBlue flies on the same engines. In 2001, Swissair aggressively expanded across Europe, buying stakes in smaller carriers without the cash reserves to sustain the operation. Within 2 years, it was filing for bankruptcy with planes grounded on tarmacs because it couldn't afford to pay for fuel. Rapid expansion without consistent cash generation isn't strategy, it's a countdown clock. JetBlue averaged 9 aircraft grounded throughout 2025, with Pratt & Whitney GTF engine issues, with mid-single digits still expected in 2026. Every grounded aircraft is revenue that doesn't exist, and for a carrier that hasn't returned to profit, each one is money bleeding out on the tarmac. Florida isn't an opportunity, it's a battlefield. Virtually every major player in American aviation moved immediately after Spirit's collapse. United, Delta, American, Frontier all announced route expansions in the same windows JetBlue was trying to fill. The vacuum existed for hours, not weeks, and while JetBlue did the hardest work, rebuilding frequencies, re-educating passengers, consolidating demand, competitors watched with growing interest. Spirit's presence had forced every other carrier to offer a minimum number of bare-bones seats to compete. With it gone, that downward pricing pressure vanished, and that benefits the majors far more than JetBlue. Delta and American have loyalty programs with tens of millions of members. They have continental hubs that feed Fort Lauderdale with connecting passengers from cities JetBlue doesn't even serve. They have balance sheets that can absorb years of pressure without putting their existence at risk. JetBlue is rebuilding a market, and the stronger it makes that market, the more attractive it becomes for carriers with far greater resources to move in afterward. Here's the paradox nobody is openly discussing. JetBlue may be doing the most dangerous work in American aviation right now, turning a devastated airport into a viable market again. It's hiring former Spirit employees, absorbing their passengers, opening routes nobody else was willing to touch in the short term. The race is on, and JetBlue is out front. But American aviation history is full of carriers that opened markets and never reaped the rewards, that did the dirty work and let rivals walk in afterward with more money, more connecting routes, and loyalty programs that turn occasional customers into locked-in ones. The real winners of Spirit's collapse may not have shown their hand yet. Maybe JetBlue is building its own empire at Fort Lauderdale, or maybe it's clearing the ground for someone who hasn't entered the game yet.